Welcome back. Today we look at positivist knowledge claims. How do positivists assert that they found knowledge? I'll start by discussing the classic textbook used in scope and methods courses in the United States, King, Cohane, and Verba's Designing Social Inquiry. It offers a view of this based in the logical positivism developed by the Vienna Circle and Karl Popper, an associate, which, interestingly, was subsequently disavowed by Karl Popper, and although designed for the sciences, has had no resonance among scientists. There are two questions here. The first, which I'll return to later, is why do American social scientists and positivist IR scholars invoke an understanding rejected by philosophers of science and ignored by the scientific community? And secondly, and this is the question I will address first, is it a useful way of making warrants? As you may remember from earlier talks, logical positivism believes that the world is real, it's out there, it's waiting to be discovered, that our theories and concepts are independent of it, but increasingly can find a concordance with the world through trial and error of repeated theories, their falsification, and their reformulation. The King, Cohane, and Verba, and while I'm picking on them, they're not alone. One of the reasons that they are the dominant text in these courses in the United States is that they reflect a position that's very widely held among those who call themselves, quote, mainstream social scientists. This position fundamentally reduces serious epistemological questions to a narrow focus on method. In King, Cohane, and Verba's reading, what knowledge is all about and what confers knowledge in the way of testing if we have knowledge is by having good data and good statistics and good methods that we've used to gather both. Now, there are some very serious problems with this. In the first place, as we know, the world isn't out there. The world is a function, a creation of our categories, at least the social world. If this is so, we can't derive any warrants of truth from the world itself. They're really a function of our concepts, and there's no particular reason to believe that one set of concepts is more valuable or more right than another. Secondly, as Alfred Schutz pointed out, another Viennese who was not an associate of the circle, but knew many of the people involved, that we can't separate data from concepts. That the data we gather are a function of our theories. And those theories are ultimately based on reifications. If we look at the world of science, it is very different than the world envisaged first by Karl Popper and the Vienna Circle, and later by King, Cohane, and Verba. Key to the Vienna Circle's understanding of warrants was verification. We should attempt to prove that our theories are correct. Karl Popper first achieved prominence by taking seriously Hume's induction problem and showing that verification wasn't really possible. At most, it could provide a provisional assurance in a theory. A particular example he gave, which I think I've used before, had to do with black swans. We might argue that all swans are white, but by constantly finding white swans, it didn't rule out the possibility that somewhere they may be a black swan. For this reason, Popper proposed falsification. And falsification is the model that King, Cohane, and Verba adopt as the gold standard for assessing social science research. Now, if we look at how science progresses, it's very different from what either the Vienna Circle or King, Cohane, and Verba surmise. In the first place, scientists are deeply impressed by verification. An example, which again I've given you before but in a different context, was Alfred Wegener's framing of what would become plate tectonics, arguing that the continents were once connected and had moved apart. I noted that in the absence of a mechanism, nobody was willing to give credence to it. But once we both had a mechanism and we had research exploring the magnetic orientation of seabeds, we could see that in fact the continents had moved apart. We had independent confirmation of this. It verified plate tectonics in the eyes of the geological community. Even more dramatic examples come from Einstein's general theory of relativity. In 1915, Einstein proposed 3 possible tests of his theory, all involving verification. One having to do with the perihelion of the orbit of Mercury and how it varied from what it appeared under the Kepler's laws that it should be. And this was known, but Einstein's theory ended up providing out to multiple places an account for not only the perihelion, but just exactly the orbit that Mercury followed. Scientists were impressed. They were even more impressed by his second and third test because they were deeply counterintuitive. The second test involved the bending of light. Nobody was prepared to believe that light bent. In fact, Max von Laue, a physicist and friend of Einstein, wrote to Moritz Schlick, the founder in some ways of the Vienna Circle, just at the end of the First World War, that it would be good to have a test of Einstein's theory when the next full eclipse came, because it would give it a peaceful death. There was just no way many physicists were willing to believe it. Well, the eclipse did show that light was bent just as Einstein suggested. And again, not this initial test, but subsequent tests with better instruments during later eclipses could measure it out to 5 or 6 places. And it conformed exactly with the predictions of the theory. The third counterintuitive claim had to do with gravity waves. That gravity, in fact, bent the very fabric of space-time, and that waves rippled across it. It was only a few years ago, in 2015 and 2017, that instruments in Louisiana and in Washington State who were able to measure the gravitational waves, and there they are, as Einstein suggested. Now, what is counterintuitive, of course, depends upon what people already believe. So, in fact, the value of a verification or a proof is as much psychological and political as it is logical. Verification remains a profoundly important way of convincing people that what you're saying makes sense. Disconfirmation or falsification turns out to be more complicated than Popper supposed, for two reasons. In the scientific community, theories or propositions can be falsified, but even what appears at the time to be a convincing falsification may not affect what scientists believe and do. They may take it aboard and say, right, let's hope something will come up at a later date to square the theory with the empirical evidence we have, or ask themselves in what ways can we play with the theory to make it accommodate this data. Sometimes this is a retrograde behavior, with the scientific community upholding a disproven theory because people want to believe it and their work is associated with it. But other times, it turns out that what was initially falsified was valid, that subsequent evidence and new ways of thinking restore the theory to its prior standing. So an ex post facto verification following a falsification. What counts in the scientific community, whether it's verification or falsification, is ultimately what members of that community believe. So, science, in dealing with the truth claims of theories, more properly resembles a court than it does some exercise of logic. And what characterizes a court? You have a judge, and that judge is familiar with and enforces procedures of the court that are designed, at least in Western democracies, to allow both sides, either prosecutor and defendant, or if it's a civil suit, the attorneys representing the plaintiff and the defendant, time to make their own case, to present arguments and evidence, to cross-examine any witness, to question the evidence that has been presented, and all of this done before a jury, who then renders a verdict. So this is what happens, or should happen, within a scientific community. You have advocates of a theory, or more broadly speaking, a paradigm in which the theory is nested. You have opponents. They make arguments, they offer evidence. They do so at professional meetings, in journals, in reviews. They go after each other. There's a back and forth. If side A offers arguments and evidence in support of its claims, side B is likely to question those arguments and evidence and may introduce arguments and evidence of its own. The jury consists of the scientific community as a whole, and more narrowly, of people whom we might call gatekeepers, those who have lots of influence in deciding what gets published, who gets grants, who gets jobs, who is admitted to postgraduate school, who receives postdocs, or any of the other benefits that are conferred by academic disciplines. This give and take and challenge and counter-challenge works well, as courts work well, when the rules and procedures are followed in an open and fair way and enforced by a judge who has no investment in a particular outcome, but rather is someone whose primary commitment is to upholding the rules and the procedures of the court. So for science to make reasonable assessments of claims really requires more of an ethical commitment than a logical exercise. Ethics and openness to assessment must come hand in hand. And in this respect, the process of science differs in one significant way from a court. Procedures of courts are long established. They may change a little bit at the edges over time. Jury selection, for example, in the United States has become much more sensitive over the decades to questions of fair representation, of not excluding minorities, people of color, this kind of thing. But the fundamental rules are unchanged. In science, this isn't so. What scientists use at any given time to assess the respective claims of proponents and opponents of a theory is itself open to challenge in the court of scientific opinion. Over time, it may change dramatically, and that kind of change may be responsible for a different judgment as to whether a theory is falsified or not, or verified or not. So there's a constant interplay between the scientific court procedures and the judgments that are based on them. It requires open minds not only about what people are saying, but the means and mechanisms and assumptions that we use to make sense of and assess what they say. If this is so, then it seems that actual science functions more closely, or maps more closely with interpretivist understandings of how truth claims are assessed. And I will come to how this works in the interpretist branch of international relations theory in my next talk. But here I want to say that what it does is it leaves positivists really out on a limb, because their approach to truth warrants derived from logical positivism is not accepted by philosophers of science, is not accepted by scientists themselves, but only by social scientists. One has to wonder the extent to which this is a kind of ideological buttress for a project trying to legitimize itself, with many members of it holding on to these beliefs in the validity of their procedures, despite very compelling challenges. Now, to be fair, not all positivists act this way. There are many who have come around to thinking that positivism needs to be saved from itself, that positivist social science should be more open to the recognition that there are multiple kinds of truths that are highly provisional, that judgment is a function not of logical warrants but of the community, that by embracing this, positivists can do better science. I will return to this question in my next talk. Thank you very much.